Started. Hello and welcome to another installment of the Changemaker series presented by the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. This is a virtual series highlighting changemakers who are using business as a force for good. Today, we've invited Dr. Joyce Cacho to share her expertise with us. I'm Sarah Neuner, and I'm so excited to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Joyce and our incredible moderator shortly. But first, we at CESR would like to recognize that CU Boulder and our work there is located on the traditional territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples. In addition, 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. And second, at this point, we are all pretty familiar with Zoom, but as a reminder, please keep yourself on mute. And I recommend the speaker view over the gallery view for this event, and that function is located on the upper right corner of your screen. To submit a question, please direct message them to me, not our moderator, to me. And you can do that by selecting my name in the chat area. Also, this session will be recorded, so folks can watch it later at their convenience. As you may know, Dr. Joyce Cacho has more than 2 decades of leadership experience creating waves of impact in a variety of areas, including sustainable agriculture, financial inclusion, and international development. She's a former Global Chief Sustainability Officer and an expert in finance, ESG, strategy, and innovation. Joyce's experience includes serving as board director for Land O'Lakes, executive director at Rabobank International, and board director for both Sunrise Banks, a certified B Corporation, and the World Benchmarking Alliance. Our moderator, Mrinal Wakode, is an incredibly talented Leeds graduate student, earning her MS in Business Analytics, and previously also earned her BS in Accounting from Leeds. Mrinal is extremely passionate about sustainability and using business as a force for good. Okay, without further ado, take it away, Mrinal.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Joyce, for taking time out of your day to speak with us. I say that we just get started. So Sarah just mentioned a few lines about you, but could you please tell us a little bit more about your background, your career, and your proudest accomplishment throughout your career?
So thank you so much. And before jumping into answering your question, Mrinal, I would like to really thank CESR and the team at the Leeds Business School for inviting me to be part of this Changemaker series. It is not often when the stars align, from scheduling to topics, to be able to share with especially young people and people in the community there this fast information about this fast moving area of business. So my background is either one of a very distracted person or one of intention through different avenues. And since I can make a choice, I prefer to see it as one of intention through several different avenues. And so when I had the good fortune of having very little risk, quite frankly, in my childhood and my upbringing. And so when you come into realization as more of an adult, and I say more of an adult because I don't think that the child part of you should ever really leave you, then you start realizing that it is, in addition to your passion, what drives you around this passion? What do you want your participation to do? And so it's not one of just honing skills and getting paid and traveling and other things, aspects of life. It becomes what remains after you have been there, Joyce. And how do you prepare for that kind of intentionality? And so my father was a CPA. That explains my appetite for finance. And he was not the kind of CPA, him and my father and mother, where you just kind of say, oh yeah, send me that money, I'm at school, I'm all right. We actually probably very uniquely had to submit budgets to get tranches of funding to go to college. So activist kind of engagement with finance came from home upbringing, and the rest is sort of history, because wherever I've gone with my intentions, I've made sure that accountability in finance is woven into it.
Thank you. And I noticed that you have a PhD in investment decision-making, corporate finance, and Brazil agribusiness. So could you speak a little bit more about your PhD, why you decided to get one? And I'm a little curious about the agribusiness part. It's very interesting.
Right. So I actually had entrepreneur experience before deciding to pursue graduate studies. And I had entrepreneur experience through a family opportunity in Zambia. And so when you cut your teeth on entrepreneurship in an emerging market environment, then you know what you know, and you want, if you're going to have impact, you want to learn in an environment that actually replicated the environment where I was an entrepreneur, and a vegetable entrepreneur, quite frankly. I was a vegetable entrepreneur locally, and I teamed up with other family members to begin the horticultural export business from Zambia to the UK. So when I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school and I was lucky enough to win a Rotary International scholarship to fund my master's, I started looking at the policy environment that supports or constrains or conflicts in the agribusiness arena. And your interest in the fact that it's a focus on agribusiness, when I walked into the Ag Econ, Agricultural Economics Department of Virginia Tech with this scholarship and said, I want to do applied economics, that was the basis for deciding to go and do my work in the College of Agriculture. They said, so what do you know other than hands-on? And I said, nothing. I came from an undergraduate degree in economics with a minor in computer science. And there was this whole immersion of understanding the history of agribusiness. Merchants of Grain is a book that if you ever want to understand the history of commodity agribusiness, it's very good at that. And I read that and a few other items and decided to focus on soybeans and the analysis of international trade competition in soybeans. Why soybeans? Because I had a mandate to look at nutrition of humans as well as livestock, and soybeans uniquely occupies that space of being able to be consumed by livestock as well as animals, and widely impacts nutrition across the world. So that explains the agribusiness part. The Brazil part is explained by my interest, again, in understanding how Brazil went from a donor-dependent country to a donor-partner country. And that understanding came through understanding their investment policy, which gave preference based on science, as well as local Brazilian consumer demand for not only soybeans, but for poultry, and just understanding how policy can set countries up to shape their own destiny in many ways.
So thank you. You have spent quite a bit of time in emerging markets. So what have you learned as a business leader in these emerging markets that you wouldn't have otherwise learned, staying here in the States? Because I'm sure there's plenty.
Well, good question. I actually balance my mature market work life and years of career in mature markets in the US. And when I worked for Rabobank, there were a lot of ties to Europe in the work that I did there and building that department, I balanced the sort of staid policy environment in which one does business, and the investment horizons in mature markets, which makes change sticky by doing work in emerging markets. So what I have learned from doing work in emerging markets, because I take an approach of, it's not a know-it-all approach, it is, what are we building? How quickly does it need to be built? What's the focus here? And my interest in inclusiveness, broadly stated, is that in emerging markets, you do not have hurdles to get over for innovation to happen. For example, I'm living and working in the US, and cell phone technology, I'm probably speaking to an audience who wonders what was there before cell phones. There was other ways in which we used telephone technology. They were fixed, not only fixed lines, but fixed instruments. But cell phone technology was taking off here, and numbers were not portable. So if you were with T-Mobile and Sprint was offering a better price or better coverage, you would have to give up your phone number. I know that's hard to believe today, but that's the universe that was the US telephony technology industry at the time. And at the same time, because I transitioned to living in Kenya, the equipment market was separate from the chip, the SIM card market. SIM cards, you go to any retail outlet, including a kiosk, and you can buy a SIM card, okay? And so one quickly, the uptake, and I'm not sharing news here, the evidence is out there. The growth of the mobile telephony market, the growth of the mobile telephony market in emerging markets is several levels of growth greater than in the mature markets USA. Eventually, numbers became portable in the US, right? But wow, was it exciting to not have that that cement block shackled to my relationship with the cell phone over in Kenya, as opposed to what my experience is here in the US. Let me just close that comment by saying this is linked to investment time horizons. In mature markets, projects such as communication towers, etc., their time horizon, the investment time horizon for useful life is 30 years, okay? And we're seeing the impact of that on infrastructure here in the US. In emerging markets, the time horizons for payoff, for useful life is a lot shorter, okay? So let's acknowledge that how financial markets, underlying assumptions of financial markets influences the risk return in emerging markets and influences the risk return in mature markets, such as the US.
Right. So switching gears a little bit, I wanted to touch on the fact that you're the board director at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And, you know, I was hoping you could explain a bit more about benchmarking and what effects have benchmarking standards had on the sustainability of business practices here in the US and all over the world.
So I am a supervisory board member, which it should immediately signal that it is for organization headquartered in Europe. In Europe, when you say supervisory board member, that signals fiduciary responsibility, okay? We have to dig a little bit deeper in how we use the term board member or trustee here in the US. But I'm a supervisory board member of a relatively new global organization, which is focused on creating a race to the top. So let me peel the onion a little bit. What we have in the area of sustainability or environment, social, and corporate governance, ESG, which is a more concrete way of speaking about sustainability, is 5 years ago, up to last year, there were several accountability frameworks that existed. Some of you may have heard about them. Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, TCFD, CDP. And where, interestingly, these kinds of accountability frameworks would historically exist for, let's say, 50 years before somebody said, SASB reports can't talk to GRI reports, can't talk to TCFD. The good news is that there's been convergence, and those organizations last December, I do believe, delivered a bit of news that they would be working together, and there's going to be a new singular accountability organization, which is great news, so that companies can all be compared on the same basis. And then in comes World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA, and they foresaw the day when accountability frameworks would not be the discussion. But once we get everybody literally on the same page, how do we then communicate to the public this is a better investment from a company viewpoint than another company, right? And so WBA has identified 2,000 companies who can move the needle on the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and are putting together industry-specific as well as cross-cutting theme indices and benchmarks, so that against that benchmark of what is good, better, best, right? There's an index, and make the information public. So it's a not-for-profit organization that they will make the information public and consistently publish where these 2,000 companies position themselves on the different indices, so that we can have companies incented to do better. So the benchmarks are the design basis for the indices.
So are these 2,000 companies all over the world, or just in Europe, or how did they decide on those companies?
The companies are all over the world. And here's for a person who has charted their career through mature markets and emerging markets. When I was asked to be on this board as a supervisory board member, I did my due diligence, my background research, and I continued in the discussion because the 2,000 companies truly are all over the world, including in Africa, in Indonesia, in across Latin America, as well as Europe, United States, Australia, etc. Right? Many organizations pull the word global, pull the word world and then talk about either don't have Africa at all, don't have critical areas of the world such as Indonesia included. And to me, that is underselling or overselling what the organization is about. So World Benchmarking Alliance, 2,000 companies are truly all over the world. And that means that the competition is not about only seeing with one eye. You must look at the results of the indexing in the competition with both eyes.
Okay, I see. So switching up gears again a little bit, I'm really curious to hear your opinion and for you to help us understand a little bit the intersection of business, racial and gender equity, and sustainability. It's a loaded question.
It's quite a loaded question, but an important one. Mm-hmm. If you had asked me that same question in 2019, it would have been harder to be clear about this. And why is that? Because 2020 came along and produced data around public health pandemic and racial and social inequity pandemic.
Right.
And so it is not imaginary anymore that those two pandemics need to be responded to now that we're in 2021, building the next normal. To focus on environment and not social inequity and social capital is to underserve the company. And I'm speaking here as a board director. Let's be clear. It has often been positioned that there are shareholders and there are stakeholders, and that those two are two different things. I'd love to share this afternoon that corporations are just stakeholders in the greater economy. And so we have the data from 2020, and now there is an imperative that corporations and their boards support strategies, help design strategies, interrogate strategies that contribute to not only improved environment, climate change, carbon footprint, water management, right? And innovate around that, but at the same time, simultaneously must contribute to closing gender equity gaps and racial equity gaps in the US and around the world.
So we have an audience question. Can you speak a little bit more on how 2020 has changed business in a very broad sense, and what are the next steps going forward?
Thanks to the audience member for asking. I think that before 2020, hand-wringing and further discussion was actually something that folks could check the box and say, yeah, we're thinking about that. We're trying. We'll discuss that in third quarter. Because of 2020, and when I speak of 2020, I always acknowledge the 500,000 people who died linked to COVID and their families. That's a steep price to pay to learn that discussing it is no longer okay. That's a general statement. And then we have specific investor declarations. I think this room fully knows about BlackRock and Larry Fink and the letters that he puts out every year, and he didn't mince words this year, where he says there are going to be consequences for not being accountable, disclosing, transparent, and actually taking action at this nexus of environment and social capital, right? So has the change actually occurred? I say not. I do say that we have the data, and you as young people, you as students, you can find people's phone number that don't want to be found.
Right.
So do your work and keep the pressure on as consumers, as employees, and as investors. Keep the pressure on while putting your brilliant minds to work to innovate new products at this crossroads. And if innovation is not celebrated, where you may find yourself as an employee, heck, we're all doing this call in pajamas. Be an entrepreneur in your pajamas and find like-minded folks to move your innovation forward.
Okay, we have another audience question, along the same lines. Can you give specific examples about what good policies and practices look like in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, that's really not fair, because Sarah says this must end in 30 minutes. Good policies where, and for who? I think that if you're talking about the business context, let's talk about a room that I'm quite familiar with, which is the boardroom. And I think we have a lot of work to do in the boardroom. So good governance in the boardroom would suggest that we do board refresh. Why is it that boardroom governance is light, L-I-T-E, on what the boardroom looks like, okay? And why is it that the boardroom is light on lead directors, board chairs, chairs of the three major committees, NomGov, Finance and Audit, and Compensation, in terms of people looking like me, right? And if you pick up that I ask questions, it's my board director framing, right? Because being a board director is not about declarative statements. It's about asking questions for which collectively as a team, a boardroom needs to come forward with an answer, or collectively as a team, the executive leadership team needs to respond to, right? When it comes to the boardroom and lacking of truly turning the corner and doing board refresh, another tactic is that's a must, especially in 2021, is asking for a financial materiality assessment, asking the executive team, when was the last time that was done? When is it going to be done again? And specifically, why we need to make sure that environment, social, governance, and diversity, equity, and inclusion are specifically examined in a financial materiality assessment before they bring a strategy forward. Because without that financial materiality assessment and those specific 6 letters being interrogated, your assumptions for the strategy that you will be approving are off.
Right.
We've had 2020. We can't stick our heads in the sand and say, we produce widgets. We need more widgets out there. And lastly, as a board director, one of our key roles is hiring the CEO. I'm not talking out of school to say that it is blatantly apparent that the CEO ranks of Fortune 500 companies is looking a little sketchy when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And without seeing yourself at the top, without making sure that the executive leadership team reflects society of tomorrow, I question whether or not the board is doing its work of duty of oversight to make sure that strategy delivers a resilient company which can weather the next pandemic or 2 or 3.
Right. So we do have another audience question. It's a bit more specific. So this audience member is curious about her own experience working with board leadership. So this audience member works with a board and they sometimes struggle with the best ways to engage with or leverage their board members' experience and expertise. And do you have any advice for the best ways to work with a board?
Advice. I will say that at WBA, we are working with a new framing called a teal organization. And that means that it is less siloed between the board and operations, if you will. And it's a new framing for corporate relationships and well suited for what we're living with and will forever be part of how we engage now, screens like this, right? So distributed teams, different time zones, board directors not having the opportunity to physically come together. And a key difference is in a teal organization is that board members are actually expected to engage with people in operations. Now, traditionally, boards are fingers out, noses in. I invariably get that phrase incorrect, but typically, to maintain your independence in the boardroom, engaging with operations is frowned upon. What I'm learning through being part of an organization being framed in the teal way is that it's not day to day as if I'm part of the operating team. I'm seen more as a resource. So because that door is open, different operating team members would ask me to assist or to brainstorm, or there's direct one-to-one, and there isn't the erosion of trust that as a board member, I am usurping leadership of the operation. So it might be that adopting and adapting to a trusted relationship with board members and operations might, focusing on that might be an on-ramp to being able to leverage your board director skills.
And we have another audience question. So Beth Ford became CEO of Land O'Lakes in 2018. So
Yeah.
are you able to say more about the selection of her as a CEO and why she's a good fit?
Very good question. So I was in the room. I feel a little bit like Hamilton, right? In the room where it happened. And it was a very well-governed process. My first, I was pleased at that. And then when you have a candidate for which there are no peers, it makes the board's work of hiring the next CEO very easy. And so the interview process was robust and exciting because Beth chose to do what she is doing a long time ago. I don't know if the person asking the question knows, but Beth used to trade on an exchange floor, stock exchange floor. She's fine. She's got finance in the background, and she was snapped up coming out of school, but she missed the people dimension, and so she did a lateral and shot over into working in ways that meant that people were a critical factor to what she did. As such, she went from strength to strength, and she brought her whole self. I think that's important to say. She brought her whole self. So she comes from a family with brothers and truckers, if I'm recalling correctly. And I was the only African American. I was the only woman. I was the first to be appointed to the board of Land O'Lakes. And it's an unwritten skill that you have, that you can be in rooms like that and it not cloud your sense of belonging, right? And I noticed that with Beth from board orientation and more. And so I was very pleased as the process moved that she emerged head and shoulders as the right thing for us to do for Land O'Lakes at that time, and have observed subsequently that she has gotten a bunch of guys to focus on a couple of things that are critical in the retail channel as well as in the technology channel.
So I'm just curious, what exactly is the process of choosing a CEO? Is it just like what you mentioned, just an interview, or is there more to it?
They're different. They're different processes. Where what I focus on is, how's this being governed? Okay. Is it a backdoor deal? Yeah, we know Jane. We know Beth. We're not going to advertise. The succession plan says that's input, succession planning. And by the way, that's a critical dimension to answering that previous question about how one works on diversity. The board has got to be engaged on succession planning, and that is a dimension of it. But I view good governance as the hallmark of what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And so the board, a proposal for a process is put forward to the board. There is discussion, and then we agree on a process, and we run with that process. So there isn't a set, this is how it's done, but it is a key job of the board. And so engagement on agreeing to that process is the first part of that job, right? And what you don't want to be is in a room where it's a done deal before discussion and process begins.
Okay, I see. That's very interesting. I just never knew that. But backing up a little bit, you previously talked about the teal model, was it? So I was just wondering, could you explain a little bit more about that? And do you think that it's the future, or a little bit more information?
So in organizing myself for this discussion, I pulled up the Leeds School of Business website, and it says, "Dare to do business differently." And daring was cutting edge in 2019. Today, it's a must do. Okay, business is forever going to be done differently. We're not going back. I'm a firm believer that didn't work for a bunch of people. So let's build a next normal that is accountable, fosters a culture of accountability, and one where empathy and understanding isn't an add-on. It's part of bringing your whole self to work, okay? And so I'm new to teal, and there's a book, and if it would be helpful for me to share the link to the book, I'm happy to do so, because what we have is putting trust as a must-have on the table. And I think that if we look back on organizations, on business before March 15th, 2020, that trust thread was worn pretty thin. And at all levels. And so it meant that siloing was the only way to make sure that persons weren't being undermined between the board and the CEO kind of thing. We've had to show up as better people or don't show up. And I think that teal is leveraging that, right? So I don't think that it's a new idea, but it might be kind of like the dare to do business differently. The time has come. So trust is at the center.
Right. We have, wait, before I get into an audience question, could you share the link? I think that would be very helpful, actually. Maybe after.
So happy to share it after. I'm noticing that Naturally Boulder has shared a link to a Bismarck blog about teal management, and I suspect that the link to the book is in there, but I'm happy to do so afterwards. Okay, Julie.
So we have an audience question. This person is wondering, you talk about bringing your whole self to work. So what advice do you have for students in our careers to show up as our whole selves, or to create an environment where people can show up that way?
Good question. So I'll tell a little story and then pull apart the answer to the question. As you can see, I'm shy. I, think twice before making myself known in a room. That's not true. So when I was finishing my PhD, the typical outlet for employment for a PhD is academia. And so I interviewed for a few assistant professor jobs. And while they were thinking about whether or not no here, multi-language, go after it, Joyce Cacho was who they wanted on faculty, I cast my resume on the waters at a professional meeting. And I fully engaged with finishing my dissertation and having a job to show for all of this effort with the PhD. A gentleman I sat beside at this professional meeting was one of 5 researchers for Rabobank International. He was a special guest, and it was just happenstance that we sat beside each other. Long and short, these were the days of faxes. You may Google that also. That was another way we used to communicate. But it turns out opportunity and preparation came together to mean luck for Joyce and for Rabobank. And so I was invited for 2 and 3 and 4 interviews before they offered me the role to head up their new research unit in New York. Well, Joyce has looked like this. No hair, very little makeup. But I did put on the navy blue suit and the white shirt I found that uniform and was offered, and I accepted the job in New York. And everybody said, when I was going for that final interview, "You're not going to grow your hair," as if that can happen overnight. And I said, no, kind of the suits as much as I can do to show up like I know the joint. Long and short of it, I asked my boss after being on the job for 18 months or so, I said, so which part of the no here thing caused concern? This is a man who is now deceased, but he was my sponsor, and I should have known that that's what he was then. He said, "Are you kidding? When you showed up with no here, it meant that you were here to do business." And so by showing up as me, I actually communicated that it's not the trappings of looking like the role that means I belong. It's what I can say, do, write, etc., and deliver for the bottom line of the bank that means that I am here to show up for the bank. So be a sponsor. Don't judge the book by the cover. Don't assume that, somebody doesn't belong because today they don't match your expectations of what belonging should look like. And further to that, and I hinted at it when you asked me about melding, going between emerging markets and developed market economies for my career. Your standard may not be the standard of everybody, and it may not be the standard of tomorrow. Look at us today. I hunted down that Austin Reed navy blue suit, the white shirt like no tomorrow, to look like a future banker. And we're all on this, in this room. And what is the dress code? When I looked at other Changemaker interviews everything from a vest, from a down jacket vest to, right? And so showing up as your whole self means, yes, being respectful, but it also means being open to learning and focusing on what matters.
Thank you so much for that response. We have another audience question, which I think will be our last question for today. Is there a project you cared about that did not succeed? And what did you learn from that experience? And how did it change the way you approached your work?
Let's define success. When I was Global Chief Sustainability Officer, I really thought it was an opportunity to work across the organization at strategic high levels and literally restructure their balance sheet and income statement. Because innovation is near and dear to me. So I have experienced a lot, and a lot of times we don't look at existing solutions by people who we assume don't know, right? And we give them what we think they need. We don't value what they bring to the table. And this was in a feed ingredient company. And given the concern for time at this moment, I think that is, I wasn't successful in getting buy-in for that approach to sustainability accountability. And what was my response? My response consistently across my career is, that wasn't successful, but I learned a lot. Let me go off and form my own company and go off to emerging markets so that I don't have 30 years of depreciation thinking to get over to move the needle forward on change.
So thank you so much. I think we're out of time. So that was the last question, but I just wanted to thank you so much for coming here and speaking with us today. I know it's all a little bit awkward on Zoom, but thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah now.
Thank you so much, Monroe.
Thank you both. A few housekeeping items before we go. CESR has many exciting upcoming events focused on sustainable and socially responsible business. So you can find more information about these events on our website. If you are an undergraduate business student, the deadline to sign up for the Business Ethics Case Competition and compete to win $6,000 is tomorrow. So be sure to do that ASAP. Last fall, CESR launched a new program called CESR Explorers, where students can receive prizes like memberships to Naturally Boulder, books on sustainable business, or even lunch with a CEO, all for attending CESR or CESR-affiliated events. And this event counts. So that's one or one more for your tally. Lastly, everything I just said will be sent to you in an email along with a feedback survey. Please take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's event. All right, thank you again so much to Joyce and Renal. We hope to see you all online soon at our next event. Okay, goodbye.